In many ways, the 1920s and 30s marked the beginning of a visible LGBTQ+ presence in the Western world. Berlin, Germany had a vast culture of queer people, including several gay bars, queer movies, and LGBTQ+ publications. German doctors in Berlin also worked on what were, at the time, experimental procedures to help trans women medically transition. Among one of the first to undergo these gender-affirming surgeries was a trans woman named Lily Elbe. Although there was still a lot of stigma surrounding queer identities, there was a certain presence of the LGBTQ+ community that made this era so interesting. This is not to say that these were the only places where queer people existed, but these were places where LGBTQ+ influence was losing some of its stigma. There was a similar era in the United States during the sexual liberation of the 20s. However, economic depression and worldwide conflict would soon bring an end to the presence of queer culture. Although homosexuality was legal for a time in places like Poland and the Soviet Union, the world was headed for a dark place, where freedoms were being restricted by the rise of fascism and dictatorships in Europe. The United States remained isolationist, focusing on helping itself in the Depression as President Roosevelt worked on his New Deal policy. Queer history was still being made, but it was being silenced by the forces of society. Fascism and dictatorships took over Europe in the 30s and 40s. The Nazi Party in Germany had severe restrictions on all freedoms, and especially those concerning LGBTQ+ rights. Thousands of queer people were arrested under the Nazi regime, and were sent to prison or concentration camps, where several met their end. This is some of the worst that came out of the dictatorships in Europe, but that does not take away from the known and unknown suffering of queer people all over the world. Under Stalin's Russia, homosexuality was recriminalized in the 1930s, and in Spain, recriminalized in the 40s. Japan, as it grew to become a player on the world stage, encouraged its citizens to participate in strict roles and loyalty to the government. Although homosexuality was technically legal, it still had stigma against breaking the usual roles that were expected in society, especially in a time when they were allies with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. The world was heading towards war, and World War II would become a catalyst for queer people to know each other's presence. The world was a muddy place, and many countries and cultures did what they could to promote unity and nationalism. However, this was often at the expense of the outliers. Pearl Harbor initiated the United States entry into the war, officially at least. Men were expected to fight, and women expected to work. On a larger scale than what had happened in the First World War, women's roles in society were changing. Women in the United States experienced a societal autonomy they were not used to experiencing. In the US Army, undergoing homosexual acts was illegal, and blue discharges were once again being given to those who were alleged in these acts. These discharges did not allow them to receive benefits from the government for serving their country, and carried large stigma. It was not only queer men in the army, but several queer women. The Women's Army Corps provided opportunity for many women to do so-called men's work, and take on traditionally masculine roles. This attracted many queer and gender non-conforming women for the chance to meet other women like them. Many queer people were sent to psychiatric wards after being outed, and experienced abuse. Although the Allies had won World War II, it had felt like a long road ahead for queer people. Lily Elbe. Lily Elbe was a famous trans woman from Denmark, who went on to become one of the first trans women to undergo gender-affirming surgery. She began wearing women's clothing in her wife's portraits, and began presenting as a female in daily life. She eventually went to seek surgery in Germany. However, she passed away when she suffered from an infection from her final surgery. Mabel Hampton. Mabel Hampton was an openly lesbian queer activist that lived during the Harlem Renaissance. She danced and performed at clubs throughout Harlem, and later in life, would go on to become a founding member of the Lesbian History Archives, and participate in numerous LGBT+ rights marches throughout her lifetime. Alan Turing. Alan Turing was a highly influential gay mathematician and scientist during World War II. The creation of the Turing machine was one of the biggest influences in computer science, and provided the framework for the modern computer. He helped win the war for the British by breaking German codes. Even with so many accomplishments, he was still convicted for indecency. Michael Dillon. Michael Dillon was a British trans man, who was one of the first to have phalloplasty, or gender-affirming surgery. He began taking testosterone in 1939 and later had top surgery. Harold Gillies, an experimental plastic surgeon, performed phalloplasty on Dylan from 1946 to 1949. He later wrote a book on his experiences, became a doctor, and after being unwantedly outed, settled in India until his death. The war ended the economic depression in the United States and brought on an age of nationalism, conformity, and strict gender roles. But in this post-war age came the rebels, those trying to dissect their society. In 1948, the Kinsey Report was published, and society's conformist lens began to crack. Tune in next time for another LGBTQ+ by the Decades.